Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Otherness in Hiding, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, our closing celebration of the exhibition Fritz Ascher, Expressionist, at the Harnett Museum of Art in Richmond, Virginia. I'm Rachel Stern, founding director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society of Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art, and curator of the exhibition. When the exhibition opened on January 15, we had no idea how radically our reality could and would change. I'm grateful that we found a way to celebrate the artists, the exhibition, and the winners of our student competition. And I thank Richard Waller and everyone at the Harnett Museum of Art for our wonderful collaboration. And I thank Allianz Partners for making our programming and educational initiatives possible. We'll start today's program with welcoming remarks by Richard Waller, Director of the University of Richmond Museums. I will then briefly speak about Fritz Ascher, followed by Professor Marion Kaplan with her keynote about hiding in Nazi Germany. How do I block that share screen? How can I block this, Ori?
I'm sorry.
Somebody started sharing, and I don't know, screen sharing.
No one should be able to except you or me.
Can you?
I will just.
Sorry.
Hold on.
Monica, could you please close down your share screen?
I'm not quite sure why. Yeah, she should not, her share screen should not even be visible.
Well,
I know that Zoom is trying to do things today, which apparently has created some problems.
We solved it. Okay. So we were with the keynote by Professor Marion Kaplan. And after that, we'll have 5 to 10 minutes for questions before Dr. Ori Soltes will recognize the winners of our student competition, followed by additional time for questions and comments. Please submit your questions through the chat function on the bottom of the screen. So now, Richard Waller, please.
okay. Well, good evening. As Rachel said, I'm Richard Waller, Executive Director of the University Museums at the University of Richmond. Thank you so much for joining us today for the closing celebration event for our exhibition, Fritz Ascher, Expressionist, in the Joel and Lila Harnett Museum of Art. The exhibition is the first American retrospective of Fritz Ascher's bold and colorful works, and features early academic studies and figural compositions, as well as his late mystical landscapes devoid of human presence. We are delighted and honored to have presented this incredible exhibition in the Harnett Museum of Art, and deeply regret that the pandemic forced us to close the exhibition early. The exhibition does live on through its presence on the museum's website, as well as the Fritz Ascher Society's website. Organized by the Fritz Ascher Society, this beautiful and powerful exhibition was wonderfully curated by Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society. The exhibition and related events are co-sponsored by Allianz Partners. We give special thanks to them for their sponsorship and support of this important exhibition and of tonight's event. A special thank you to Rachel Stern for organizing and bringing this exhibition to reality at the University of Richmond. I'll turn it over to Rachel now.
Thank you, Richard. This is the first US retrospective of the artist Fritz Ascher. Born in 1893 into a Jewish family in Berlin, Ascher was baptized in 1901 when he was 8 years old. At the age of 16, upon recommendation by the prominent painter Max Liebermann, he attended the Königsberg Art Academy, followed by his studies with Lovis Corinth in Berlin. He soon joined the city's avant-garde art circles. In addition to literature, theater, and sports, the artist was interested in mystical and spiritual themes. Now I'll try to share my screen with you. So you can just quickly have a bit of an idea how this looked like. The onset of World War I in 1914 seemed to have focused the 21-year-old on himself. While many of his contemporaries went to battle with neo-religious feelings for the fatherland, Ascher's artworks reveal a battle with his religious identity and suggest his inner strife. He now found his very own pictorial language, in which he combined expressive strokes and intense colors with descriptive outlines and a flat application of paint. In his drawings, Ascher continued to observe the Berlin society. Semitic and Aryan prototypes confront each other and reflect on the... Okay, I don't know why this does not work. Okay, here we go. Semitic and Aryan prototypes confront each other and reflect on the intensifying political and social polarization in German society. Like many expressionists, Ascher embraced existential and religious themes. Golgotha from 1915, Golem from 1916, and The Tortured from the 1920s are complex figural compositions which interpret traditional themes in a radically new way. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor. A few months later, in September 1933, Expressionist art was declared degenerate, and the Jewish-born Ascher was forbidden to produce, exhibit, or sell his art. Arrested during the so-called Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, in 1938, Ascher was deported to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp and then incarcerated in Potsdam prison. In 1942, 3 years after his release from jail, he received a warning about the planned mass deportation of Berlin Jews and went into hiding, supported by a family friend in the city's Grunewald neighborhood. For 3 years, he hid in a tiny space in her part of the basement. Unable to paint or draw, he composed poems evoking themes of love and divinity or nature as a spiritual refuge. Emerging after the war's end in 1945, Ascher stayed in Berlin and immediately returned to painting, while remaining largely withdrawn from society. Initially, he repainted some of his existing works with colorful dots and streaks. Then, inspired by the nearby Grunewald forest, he depicted vivid landscapes as well as powerful close-ups of the sun, trees, and flowers, which celebrate survival and the continuity of nature. He worked with renewed immediacy and urgency, dramatically simplifying forms and medium. His thick, bright pigments suggest both vibrant, life-affirming joy and, in the rough nature of his brushstrokes, a dark inner anguish transformed into light. At the end of 1968, the villa in which he lived was sold for demolition, and Fritz Ascher was forced to move. He died soon after, on March 26, 1970. The 3 years that Fritz Ascher spent in hiding very much altered his life in art. Our keynote speaker, Marion Kaplan, extensively researched what it meant to go into hiding and try to survive as a Jew in Nazi Germany. Marion Kaplan teaches modern history, Jewish history, at New York University, and has written widely on the history of Jews in Germany and of Jewish women. Professor Kaplan is a 3-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award for her books, The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany in 1991, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany in 1998, and Gender and Jewish History, co-edited with Deborah Dash-Moore in 2011. Her latest publication is Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, which came out the beginning of this year. Marion Kaplan, welcome.
Thank you, and congratulations to the imaginative winners of the contest, which we'll learn about a little bit later. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes, well, about 15, 20 minutes, about going underground in Germany. So most Jews waited till the last minute to dive underground once they knew that deportation meant death. They were known as U-boats. Between 10 and 12,000 Jews in Germany tried to hide, and about half did so in Berlin, a city of 4.5 million people. Hiding was extremely dangerous and nearly impossible for all Jews. And we have to remember that no one knew that Germany would lose the war. Without any clear idea of what lay in store for them, they held out, both the rescuers and those they hid. About 2/3 of Jews who hid did so when advance notice or organized deportation stopped and arbitrary roundups of Jews began in late 1942. They had already seen friends and relatives deported and had not heard a word from them. They began to understand something terrible was happening in the East under German military occupation. Many made split-second decisions to dive. Hiding could mean ducking out of sight by removing the yellow star affixed to their clothing in September 41, and it could mean assuming an Aryan, that is a non-Jewish German identity, with or without legal identity papers. How long could their money or their false IDs last? How long would strangers care for them? Estimates of those submarines who hid from their persecutors range from 6,500 to 12,000 Jews, with only about a quarter surviving. The rest were caught by the Gestapo, the German secret police, denounced by neighbors and spies, or died from exposure, malnutrition, and bombings. Memoirs of the few survivors stress how agonizing illegality was, not only because of the danger, but because most of these people felt like outlaws for the first time in their lives. Of the successful hiders, about 58% were women and 42% were men. Men who hid were in greater danger than women, since most men of military age had been drafted. So men walking the streets were suspicious just by being there and subject to police ID checks. Toward the end of the war, there were also manhunts for deserters or forced laborers who had escaped. As a result, men in hiding usually did not go out. Jewish women could blend with other women or work more easily as servants or nannies. And that also explains that Ascher never went out. He stayed in his cellar. Strangely enough, daily life grew more simplified than before. Now it was a matter of food and shelter. Carrying a backpack with a few essentials, many Jewish fugitives left their homes where they could have been recognized and looked to coworkers, friends, and non-Jewish relatives for their first shelters. Since mixed marriages, those between a Jewish and a non-Jewish partner, were still legal if endangered, they provided help to Jews trying to hide. Research surveys show that almost half hid with distant family members, but often had a split as they changed hiding places to avoid suspicion. Other Jews approached total strangers. In one study, only half of the fugitives knew their first rescuer. In fact, many decided impetuously both to hide and to shelter a Jew. In 1942, for example, Erna Putterman, age 23, arrived at a friend's door saying, quote, "Today they took my mother." Her friend responded, "Then you'll stay here." Jews with light hair and eyes had an easier time avoiding suspicion from neighbors. One hidden Jew recalled that the stereotypes of dark-skinned, dark-haired Jews saved many lives, since most Germans, quote, never suspected German-looking people of being Jewish. Looks mattered, but so did bearing. Appearing confident was also important. Living as hunted prey, Jews had few of the amenities they had been used to, or that most people had been used to. These included hiding in dark places with no light, using buckets instead of toilets, finding little or no opportunity to bathe, and sometimes becoming infested with lice or not moving at all for days at a time, even if they lived in an apartment house. because neighbors might hear them. The sheer boredom of hiding drove some into the streets where they were caught, while accepting monotony saved the lives of the more patient. Fugitives also hid in attics, cellars, workshops, storerooms, behind staircases or false walls, or in storehouses or barns. These were mostly cramped, dingy, and damp. In Berlin, small garden sheds with surrounding plots of lands on the outskirts of town provided frequent, though dangerous, refuge, since the Gestapo made regular sweeps through these gardens. Others had to leave their shelters early and return late in the day to avoid their protectors' neighbors or friends. And that meant finding warm places to stay or freezing in the Berlin cold during winter. One woman spent some nights in a phone booth, freezing, but protected from the wind. And although Berlin turned out to be a safer place to hide, if only because of the big city's anonymity, some Jews preferred hiding in villages, especially when the Allies focused their bombs on the cities. One mother and two daughters spent 2.5 years walking from village to village. Quote, every single day, no matter what the weather, we walked on, often cold and hungry. We slept in farmers' shacks. I used to break into those shacks. I made sure we never went to a village more than once. I asked farmers for food. I told them we had been bombed out. They would not have helped us if they had known we were Jews. The classic hiding story is that of Anne Frank's family, but theirs was an unusual situation. Unlike her family in an Amsterdam attic, many Jews in hiding changed lodgings frequently, sometimes to minimize questions neighbors might ask, sometimes because they had not told their non-Jewish rescuers that they were Jewish for fear of being turned away. One survey found that 300 people were needed to hide 65 Jews. Another survey concluded it took about 30,000 non-Jews to risk their security, not usually their lives, to hide 6,500 Jews, approximately the same ratio as the earlier one. A young woman and her mother hid with at least 12 people in the course of 27 months. Many Jews had 1 or 2 hiding places, but others lined up in case of emergencies. What were those emergencies? Distrustful neighbors or fearful rescuers, but also increasingly bombings. Jews in hiding could not usually enter bomb shelters, but they could be arrested if caught in the apartments. Also, their shelters could be bombed altogether. Part of the daily life of those in hiding included the, quote, constant alarms, burning houses, burned out apartments, blocked off streets blanketed in black smoke, bombed out people and disturbed children, and blocks of ruins. Bombings of Germany from 1940 to 45 gave some of those in hiding the easy excuse that their homes had been bombed and their local records offices had been bombed as well, all of which was believable. Thus, the bombings could have a positive side for Jews, giving some the opportunity to blend in with other bombing victims and pretend they were Aryans whose legal papers had been destroyed. Then, in some cases, Jews applied for something called the Evacuated Family Support Certificate, saying that they had come from another town that had been bombed, including all the town's records. One woman even took an identity paper from a dead body she came across. She wrote, "Suddenly, I got the idea. Check if it has an identity card on it. And in that moment, I took off and I was lucky." As a result of the chaos created by bombings, some Jews without any shelter could then spend the nights in cafes, bars, waiting rooms, and streetcars, blending in with other homeless, non-Jewish people. Importantly, even though Jews in hiding suffered from the bombings gave all Jews hope that the Allies would win the war. Indeed, many of them write that they preferred to die of bombs than to fall into the hands of the Nazis. I mentioned shelter and food, so let's turn to the latter. Jews living illegally could no longer use their ration cards. Some tried to obtain illegal identification cards, or if they still had some money, they paid for forgeries. Others just resorted to the black market for food. But even those with relatively secure hiding places lost a great deal of weight. One woman, pretending to be a Polish forced laborer, served in a Nazi household where the owner counted the fruit on the trees so she could not take anything. Once in a while, she took an egg that a chicken had just laid. Unlike the fruit trees, she wrote, the chickens never gave me away. Sickness, almost inevitable because of undernourishment and exposure to bad weather, could cause a real emergency, since seeking medical care increased the risks of being caught. Jews, even women in childbirth, avoided medical personnel or hospitalization. Some preferred the risk of death to the risk of discovery by the police. Money, too, played a role in life and death. At least a quarter of the rescuers in one study required money or some work from the person they hid. And some Jews had stashed away money as times grew dangerous. Some rescuers, of course, needed the money because everyone was rationed. Also, most Jews wanted to pay for their expenses if they could. When money was not available, some cleaned house, tailored clothing, or cooked. Jews often concealed their real identities from their rescuers to avoid being refused shelter, but also to protect their hosts from implication in their ruse, which could cost them prison sentences and possibly their lives. Some Jews who revealed their identities to their first helpers hid their identities afterwards, pretending to be Christians. In addition to Jews, by the end of the war, army deserters and forced laborers who had escaped captivity were on the loose. Rescuers and Jews in hiding left much unsaid, and those who knew or suspected they were hiding a Jew often pretended ignorance as well. In the end, hiding meant keeping out of harm's way, whether from informers or bombs, and finding food. But it was also a, quote, tedious, enervating job, more like an assembly line worker's duties for Jews and their helpers. Ruth Andreas Friedrich portrayed rescuers like herself as, quote, risking their necks every hour and every day for a couple of miserable bread coupons, a temporary emergency shelter. No one who did not go through it themselves can imagine how difficult it can be to provide even the simplest assistance under such circumstances. All grew tired of, quote, endless days of deception and anxiety. Hiding took an enormous psychological toll, requiring courage and patience from both the rescuer and the hider. The psychological toll of hiding was compounded by the terrible grief and guilt some Jews felt about surviving after their families had been deported. Could they have helped to hide them? Lotte Pepek, for example, hid in a monastery, but returning to Germany later, she wrote, quote, it was generous, this life, but my soul withdrew from that alien borrowed peace and wandered eastward to the place of its allotted fate, toward calamity and ruin. Her family had all died in the East. Now a few words about the statistics after the war. After the war, between 3,000 to 5,000 Jews came out of hiding in Germany. In Berlin, a city that once had 160,000 Jewish inhabitants, about 6,500 Jews hid, of whom only 1,700, about a quarter, survived. Fewer than 1% of the original Jewish population in 1933 were rescued. And the average age of survivors for women was about 37, for men about 39. So the middle-aged group managed to survive better than the very younger ones or the much older ones. So I think I'm going to stop there and be happy to answer some questions. when the time comes.
Okay, so thank you so much, Marion. And I'm asking everyone to please use the chat function on the bottom of the screen to type your question. Natalia Wormick writes, thank you for the wonderful lecture. I'm working on the architectural and topology of hideouts in Poland. For example, in the Tweed Grave Basement in Silesia region. Most of them are not commemorated. My research relies on a critical restoration of memory of them. Do hideouts have their commemorations in Germany and Berlin? If so, do they show stories of blackmailers and rescuers?
There is a rescuers museum in Berlin run by Beate Kosmala, Kosmala, and it's the story of rescuers. There is no archaeology or no architecture that I know of, but there's a wonderful little tiny memorial between two buildings, and it's the workshop of a man who manufactured brushes, like brooms and brushes to clean boots with and things like that. And he hired blind Jewish workers. And for a while, several of them hid out because he was able to claim they were doing essential work for the war. And so that memorial is there because it was also a kind of hiding place. Inge Deutschkron, who wrote a book called Outcast, which is her memoir of hiding in Berlin. She worked in that workshop as well. So I know of that one. I'm trying to think if there's any other hiding place that is memorialized, and I can't come up with anything. So I'm not sure that's been focused on so much. And remember, a lot of these hiding places were individual. In other words, people took in one or two Jews, and a lot of them were bombed out. So to that extent, I don't think that there's been a real archaeology or just uncovery of the hiding places.
I have a question for you, Marion, if I may. You just said that most of the rescuers risked their security, but not their lives. Was that like that everywhere, or just in Germany, or like, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, they certainly risked their lives in the East. There's no question about that. If Jews were caught, the Poles who were hiding them were shot. There's no question that they risked their lives in the East. In Germany, much less so, because people who were caught were punished, were sent to jail, acted like stupid, said, I didn't know they were Jewish, I thought they were bombed out. So a lot of them acted as if they didn't know, and they may not have known. So I don't really think they risked their lives. Of course, if you happen to also be a communist, you might have risked your life. So to that extent, there's a story that I tell in my book about a woman. She knows there's going to be deportation. She's about to get rounded up. Her husband says, let's kill ourselves. And she says no, because they have a young son, a young teenager. And so she just takes a suitcase full of their important papers and some silverware, walks down the street to look for someone she can leave the suitcase with. And it's so heavy that she stops, looks to her left and sees a shoemaker, and goes in and says, do you mind holding this for us? We're about to be deported. And he says, I can do better than that. I can hide you. Now, that's amazing. She was asking him to hold on to a suitcase. He and his brother hid her husband, and her son, and they happened to be communists. So she happened to luck into a communist shoemaker. And that was lucky, but they would have been in big trouble if they had been caught.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think the next question is more for me. Robin Stronging asked, to what extent did people in hiding turn to art, and are more artists previously unknown coming to light? I don't know, do you want to say anything about that? I'm happy.
I don't know. You're the other person.
I'm happy to speak about it, Rachel, if you want, but you go ahead.
Great.
Well, of course, there are more and more artists coming to light and being recognized, especially because Wright, for many years, it was not in the interest of the German people, of the European people, to look at art that dealt with that period, or to bring that out. This discovery is only happening the past 20 years, I would say. But what also happens, I think, with a lot of artists, that they were only after the year, after that experience in the 70s, in the 80s, started to give their experience artistic expression. And maybe you can, I think, or you can say much more about that.
There are, at this point, we're aware of scores of artists, some of whom survived, many more of whom perished, and many of whom managed to produce stuff while they were in hiding, while they're on the run, while they were in concentration camps. Of course, the poster child for the latter is Theresienstadt, or Terezin, where it was actually, to a certain extent, permitted by the Nazis, but while things that the Nazis accepted were being produced by both grown-ups and children, there were many artists, some of them professional, many more of them not, who essentially were keeping records, who were depicting what was going on so that there would be a record of what was going on, particularly given, in the case of Terezin, that it was a sham. It was presented to the world as this kind of wonderful place that Hitler built for the Jews. And when the International Red Cross would come in, they would allow themselves effectively to be deceived regarding that, and so on and so forth. So there were accordingly inhabitants of Terezin, some of whom survived, many more of whom ended up at Auschwitz and did not, who on matchbook covers, on scraps of paper, aside from more effective means, were actually keeping records. And we have handfuls here and there in other places as well. But the number of artists is extraordinary across Europe who were trying to keep records. Of course, the most famous recently is Felix Nospam, and the museum that was created in his hometown of Osnabrück happens to have been the site where Rachel organized the first Fritz Ascher exhibition a couple of years back, because Nospam has come to be recognized. He was amazing, not just because of the quality of his art, and he was a professionally trained and very successful and skilled artist, but the fact that he was on the run the whole time, and he somehow was managing to paint. He found space and he'd paint, and then he's gone and he'd paint. Very different from Fritz Ascher, who the whole time that he was in hiding had no access to any materials, but of course, art can't be crushed, so he turned to a different medium, as you know from what Rachel said earlier, to poetry, and then returned to visual art after the war.
So thank you, Ori. Now you already kind of introduced yourself before I got the chance to officially introduce you. Ori Soltes is first and foremost for us the co-founding director of the Fritz Ascher Society, but he also teaches at Georgetown University across a range of disciplines from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. He's the former director of the B'nai B'rith Kluznik National Jewish Museum and has curated more than 85 exhibitions there and in other venues across the country and overseas. He has authored or edited 21 books and scores of articles and essays. My favorite of those, most favorite of those is, we're a little short on time, I could go on and on about both of our speakers. but very important of one of his works is Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, that came out in 2017, I believe. Right, Ori?
I think so, yeah.
So, but we need to move on. We want to say congratulations to the winner of our student competition. Congratulations to Stephen Cain, Louis Caceres, Betty Isakov, Joseph Murphy, and Stella Wright. I now invite Ori to please speak about the competition and the winners of our competition.
It is my pleasure to honor those who are being honored. There are 5 of them, and I believe we have for each what the entry was. Are you going to put that up on the share screen, Rachel? And I will be briefly talking about each, simply following alphabetical order. So Louis, you're first up to bat. And is your name properly pronounced Caceres?
Yes.
The accent on the first syllable, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, Caceres. He's a 12th grader from the Manhattan Center for Science and Math in New York. And what you hear, it's coming up now, what he did was to write an essay, which I thought was rather a fine one, as did Rachel, as did Richard. So that's why you're here. And you can all try, if you wish, to read at your leisure, or otherwise you can hear just the brief comments that I will make, and afterwards, particularly since this is all being recorded, you can actually read his whole essay. But I think it's interesting the way he shaped it. As you can see, just visually, it's got 3 paragraphs, 3 parts to it, and 3 points in a way that interweave each other. So his introductory paragraph is very much not only about otherness, which is the title really of the competition and also therefore of his essay, but he connects otherness in particular to the other who withdraws, not the other who is forced into withdrawal by others, although clearly that can happen, but the other who pulls back because of being othered and withdraws. And of course that can be, these are all high school writers and poets and artists whom we're honoring. That can be in the context of high school, can it not? Obviously, in the case of Fritz Ascher, and that brings us to the second kind of paragraph and discussion point of Lewis's work, Ascher is forced to withdraw, although he's very much a withdrawing kind of personality, as Rachel can tell you better than I. So it's both the context of the Holocaust and his own personality leading up to it that caused him, who earlier on was rather social, to become more and more, how shall I say it, as Lewis would, withdrawn. And in the context of that forced withdrawal and self-withdrawal, it was difficult for him, as I said a moment ago, to paint. So he began to write poetry, which was very, very intense poetry, as a matter of fact. And that leads really directly into the third takeaway that Lewis derives from the story of Ascher, from the exhibition, and from their relationship with the concept of otherness. And that is that Ascher continues to write poetry and then is able to go back to art and turns very much to nature. And it's interesting, one may look at Ascher's turn to nature because post-war, and he lives until 1970, as Rachel said, there are relatively few images of humans, much more of nature. One can look at that in a negative way, that he's turned away from faith in humanity toward the larger picture of nature. But Lewis looks at it in a more positive way, that he even more, and I think it's a good point, Lewis, incarcerated for 3.5 years, separated from nature, he never went outside, he more than ever appreciates what it is, and the beauty of the trees, and the beauty of the sunflowers, and the beauty of the sun and the moon. And that's where he turns to. But the ultimate kind of takeaway is that even if art can be othered, it cannot be silenced. And Ascher is a symptom and a symbol of that imperative to do art of whatever sort, even if one is othered. It can be othered, it can't be silenced. So a beautiful essay.
Thank you.
And thank you. Did you want to actually, Louis, anything you want to say at the moment?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one point that like something like this is still very relevant in today's world. It's still something that we can really draw a lot of good points from. The fact that he was like at this moment right now, we're in quarantine, we're locked up in our homes basically, and being locked down, it's somewhere where you can like get inspired, and there's still like a lot of things you can do. And just, you know, art in all of its forms is an amazing thing, and it's something that's really beautiful, and you're able to tell just a whole story through it. And I think that's what Fritz Ascher was able to do.
Thank you. Thank you. And of course, there's an irony. When this exhibition opened and when you guys began thinking about this stuff, we were not yet to the pandemic degree we've arrived at. So it has become more and more personalized, I think, for everyone, both in the lockdown sense and frankly, in the way within our own country in particular, certain of our leaders have tried even more strenuously than before to other certain groups. Anyone who is not us, and then they define us in a particularized way.
Mm-hmm.
This leads me alphabetically to Stephen Cain, who is a 10th grader from St. Joseph's Preparatory School in Philadelphia, PA. And I think, yes, Stephen's essay is up. Louis talked broadly about Fritz Ascher and the relationship to otherness. Stephen focused particularly on the work of art that you see before you, which you can recognize as a one. This is not because of the non-color availability. This is a work which is done with blacks and grays and a little bit of white, as Stephen himself points out very clearly, and sees that as a kind of symbol and symptom of a kind of sweep of Jewish history in which historically and culturally Jews have had to struggle. So Fritz Ascher becomes a particularized and culminating kind of exemplum of that condition, but neither alone, obviously, during that period, nor is that period the only period in which this has been the fate of Jews. So that Ascher is, in Stephen's mind, using this figure of a man as a kind of symbol of that kind of struggle, that kind of suffering, deliberately choosing blacks and grays rather than going in the coloristic direction. Furthermore, and you can see this if you have a chance to look at it more closely, presenting a very decrepit kind of face, one that has been worked and overworked so that it suggests a kind of lifetime of struggle. He also points out, Stephen does very effectively, that Ascher chose to depict this individual essentially from just below the waist up. Put another way, as he does, the upper body is there, the head is there, the legs are missing. So the whole idea of legs and what they represent with respect to mobility and what one can do and where one can go, which in the case of this image is missing, strikes him as also symbolic of the condition actually that Marion described in a rather interesting way, because immobile and yet in reverse, if you were lucky, you could be mobile to a point, and you tried to be more mobile so as to protect yourself and those who are protecting you by moving from place to place. But obviously, we're talking still within very circumscribed, very prescribed limits. Most particularly, Stephen takes note of the beautiful way in which the face and the head are worked, not just by way of the kind of striations that suggest this kind of struggle, but the fact that if one looks very carefully, one realizes to our right, the left of the head, there is a hand. There are hands holding this head up. So at one and the same time, Stephen suggests, there are those who abandon us, and this is someone abandoned. There are those who help us. This is someone who is being helped. And the hand coming out of nowhere, out of the mist, is, he suggests, a kind of symbol of the hand of God. It's God who helps this figure up. It's God who helps this figure survive. And when you look at the upward facing eyes, they remind me in particular, and I think Stephen alludes to this as well, of any number of images of martyred saints looking up to God, transcending the pain to which they're being subject through their connection to God. And that's what he's suggesting is true of this image as well. So Ascher pulls from a number of different aspects of experience in this work, and Stephen lays out those aspects rather effectively, I think. Stephen, I can't see you, but I assume you are there, and you're also entitled to a comment if you want to add one.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Soltes.
There you are.
Yeah, I'm just honored and humbled to, get this award. The Fritz Ascher Society is a really, it focuses on, this guy's art, despite the fact that, he lived through some troubling times. It's great to see how he, persevered and kind of did what he wanted to do, regardless of people of his own kind being persecuted. So, I wish I could have been at the actual society site like last year, but
yeah.
So I'm just really happy to, I'm just really humbled to get this award. So
thank you. And I have to say to both you and Louis, I remember thinking about a week or two into this kind of self-incarceration through which we're going. I live in this beautiful house. I've got this beautiful study. I look out on beautiful trees. And I thought of Fritz Ascher. I'm thinking, I'm not in a basement somewhere. I'm not worrying about bombs dropping on me. So really, we're spoiled. We don't have that much to complain about compared to what other generations have been through in other contexts. I mean, what Marion described, as she can tell you, is the tip of an iceberg. And so it's great for us to wrestle with these things. And it's also great for us to recognize how fortunate we are compared to someone like Fritz Ascher and many others like him. And that leads me, thirdly, again by alphabet, to Betty Isakov, a 12th grader from the Hebrew Academy of Nassau County, but she lives, if I'm not mistaken, in Flushing, just to make that clear. And provided with this painting a bit of a description, so just in case I hadn't gotten it, I would have gotten it, and there's a lot to get here. You can recognize, even on this small screen, this kind of beautiful series of colored gradations that, depending upon whether you want to think up to down or down to up, carry you from a kind of yellow through a kind of violet pinkish up to a deep dark reddish, or in reverse if you want to go from down to up, punctuated by these beautiful fluffy kind of cumulus clouds. And then obviously in the dead center, you have this odd entity. What we're looking at aside from it is God-made. It's soft, it's relaxed, it's beautiful. And then in the center, you have something which is not made by God, it's human-made. It's something rectilinear, it's something that is dark. It's something that, handled slightly differently, but deliberately she does not, might strike you as a bolt of lightning. But of course, it's not a bolt of lightning. It's this, what's it doing there, black thing, which is part of what we cannot help given the context, but recognize as probably part of a swastika that's not all there. We might remember that the swastika was a symbol when it was first developed as a geometric form, this broken cross of the sun in India. And it stood for, the word swastika from Sanskrit means intense goodness. And the Nazis took it, they twisted it around so it switched direction and of course turned it into a symbol of everything evil. And what you probably cannot see unless your eyes are very good, you see one here, you see one there, is a handful actually of these tiny red swastikas kind of floating around this central element as if they're little birds, except they're not birds. They're, as it were, the opposite of birds. So what we have here is a kind of intense visual moment of encapsulating beauty that is confronted with ugliness, goodness that is confronted with evil. To think back to Stephen's terms in his essay, those who help and those who turn their back, those who are oppressing and those who are trying to relieve those who have been oppressed. It's a beautiful work. And Betty, do you want to make a comment? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I just had to admit.
There you are.
I just want to say thank you very much. It feels really amazing and honored that I get to be here, like in this award ceremony. And also, like the day, I remember last year when I also joined the Fritz Ascher competition, an artist like Fritz Ascher really inspired me, and it really made me to continue, like it kept my inspiration going with my artwork and developing more pieces.
That's great. And by the way, it is interesting, is it not? He inspired you and your style is completely different from his, which proves that one can be inspired to do art by art, and yet one's own personality, one's own individual sensibilities drive one in one's own direction. That's the sign of a true artist. You're not a slavish imitator. You are an original in your own direction. So thank you for joining us. And this leads me to our fourth honoree, who chose poetry, also from St. Joseph's Prep in Philly, also a 10th grader. This is, of course, Joseph Murphy. And in his case, because it's easily seen, I'm just going to quickly read the whole poem to you and then make a few comments about it, okay? Assimilation consumes, splits and discards the hearts of those who rise to their post with a knife to the throat. Alone he stood, hoping for others to come to his aid, but they laid down their lives only for these hopes to soon fade, marching along with the weights of the stripes, dragging you, drowning you. Night after night, will the blood of our cause forever stain their tainted goals? Can we distinguish, extinguish, diminish their never-ceasing control? We will not give in to the fears of the night. Forever gleaming, will our Star of David shine bright. And I call to your attention in this beautiful poem a number of words, lines, and moments in particular. Very clearly, this is about the aloneness of the otherness, which is our theme, that question that is raised in the first several lines as to where things are going to go. But then the question that follows that question of, will there be those who help or only those who don't help? Will there be those with a knife in the throat? Will there be those who will answer the hope to come to one's aid? Will there be those who lay down their lives? Or is it only that the hopes of help do fade? And again, one thinks very distinctly of Ascher and his situation, the people who helped him, the officer with whom he had to check in, who told him, you're about to be deported, you've got to disappear, who didn't have to do that but did. And Martha Grassmann, of course, who hid him for all that time, by contrast to what Rachel can tell you better than I, happened to his own mother, who could not be saved, as it were, by his own sisters, who had married non-Jews and were afraid to risk their own situation by offering refuge to her. So within one family, you get that range of possibility that, that distinguishes between the hope for others to come to one's aid and hopes to fade. And then I find particularly interesting that phrase, the weights of the stripes, because it seems to me, Joseph, that you're punning in a way on two things. Stripes, of course, evoke in the Holocaust context the striped garments that the inmates of concentration and extermination camps were forced to wear. But stripes also is also a turn of phrase. When you beat someone, the marks you leave are also called stripes. How many beatings do you have to take? How many stripes will you have? And that opens this discussion up to a whole range of sufferers. It connects the condition of those in the Holocaust, for example, to the condition of African-American slaves over the course of so many generations who were beaten, who bore the weight of stripes. So stripes play, it seems to me, in two different directions that relate to each other. And of course, we come at the bottom of the painting to that nice sequence, night, that rhymes with bright, and sandwiched in between those two words, fears of the night, or those two phrases, and shining bright, the idea of the Star of David, which once again plays, it seems to me, in double direction, as so many elements of your poem do, because the Star of David, as it shines bright at the end, of course, is a symbol of pride. It's a symbol of Jewish survival. It connects, for example, to the flag of the State of Israel. But in the Nazi context, The Star of David was that upon the chests of Jews that in the color yellow, they were forced to wear to identify them. And so what had been positive became a negative. What was negative could still become at the end a positive. And your poem wrestles with all of these positive, negative, dark, light possibilities of which Ascher's condition is such an intimate and perfect symbol. Joseph, any comments that you want to add?
I just want to thank you for the opportunity to write about Fritz Ascher and his experience, because the themes of otherness are definitely very prominent right now in the world, especially during the pandemic, nationwide. Obviously, socioeconomically, groups are not able to properly prepare for the pandemic and get the materials needed. And in countries such as Italy, ageism discriminates healthcare, and many are not able to get proper care. So otherness definitely exists, and the opportunity to write about it is very great. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, well, you understand, you guys, you're the next generation. We're going to all throw it on your shoulders to succeed where we have failed. Where have we failed? To learn well enough from the very thing that these poems, prose works, and artworks are talking about. We haven't learned well enough to fix things. So hopefully, in the next generation, you'll do a little bit better than we have. Please, try. Which leads me, apropos of younger generations, to our fifth honoree, Stella Wright. I think this is the first time in our 2 times thus far of having this kind of a competition in an exhibit context, that instead of just high schoolers, we had junior high schools. So we have Stella Wright, a 7th grader from Tomahawk Creek Middle School in Midlothian, Virginia. So we've moved up and down the East Coast, by the way, in this. And you can see that she has taken a very quasi-abstract direction in addressing the concept of otherness in a way that I think is very clever. So the first thing one notices, I think, or at least the first thing I notice, is that this piece in front of us that looks simultaneous like a large piece of a puzzle that you would stick into a larger picture, but at the same time, it's a kind of stylized, primitivist representation of the human form. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. So it's abstract and it's figurative, and it is in and of itself made up of pieces that are overtly suggestive of a puzzle, all of its interlocking elements working together in order to complete the piece, or put another way, all of those interlocking elements fit together in order to complete the piece that is not just a puzzle piece, but a human being, albeit stylized. The puzzle of what humans are all about. This is a very sophisticated approach to the question of otherness. She has deliberately, of course, contrived the pieces of different colors, blue, red, yellow, primary colors, the very foundation of the coloristic universe, which is the foundation of art, which is the foundation of what we think about when we think about visual art, its color in the context of painting, but fitted together in this wonderfully abstract manner. The colors are other from each other. Now you understand, of course, that these colors can be combined, can't they? So as long as we stay rigorously and rigidly other, we remain yellow, blue, and red. If we are able to transcend the boundaries between our colors, we end up with oranges, we end up with greens, we end up with purples. The possibility of the rainbow of colors, of the tapestry of colors, expands to the degree that we're able simultaneously to retain the distinct separation of our individuality, but not think of ourselves as so othered that we can't merge with others and produce other colors. So a very sophisticated, highly symbolic work, Stella Wright. And I really appreciate it. And if you would like to add a comment or two, everyone is waiting with their ears wide open for you.
Not much. I just wanted to say that I'm really happy to get this far in the competition for the conference.
That's great. Well, we are thrilled that all 5 of you produce such interesting and diverse and varied work. And needless to say, from the perspective of the Fritz Ascher Society and from Rachel and from me, the notion that this guy, Fritz Ascher, who struggled to survive and then who managed to come out the other end and continue to paint, can inspire in so many different directions, I think is wonderful. Rachel, Madam President, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ori. Congratulations again to the winners of our contest. Thank you, Marion, for your inspiring keynote. And thank you, everyone, for celebrating with us. Stay with us, stay in touch through our website. We publish a newsletter, fritzaschersociety.org. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. So communicate with us and stay with us. And thank you so much for being with us. Stay healthy, stay strong, and stay well.
And one more thank you, if I may, to Richard and the museum and to Allianz for its support of this and other projects related.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you back to Ori and Rachel. It's been a wonderful experience to work on the exhibition with you. And Marion, and just your talk was tremendous. Thank you so much for that.
And
it's a good way to close our.
By the young people as well. Thank you all for saying something.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.